A woman didn't show up for work and police got involved. Right from the start, detectives hit a wall. There were plenty of clues, but none that actually led anywhere. And the case dragged on for years. But when the truth finally came out, it was so unexpected that everyone was left in absolute shock. Leslie Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, in Rhode Island. She was one of 8 children, and the family moved often because her father served in the army. When she was 12, they moved to Pensacola in Florida, where Leslie finished school. After that, she enrolled at the University of Florida to study journalism, and there, she met a young man named Carl. In 1974, when Leslie was 22, they got married, and 3 years later, they had a daughter, Lauren. Sometime later, the family moved to a town called Chevy Chase, a suburb of Washington, D.C., and Leslie took a job at an advertising agency. In the years that followed, she lived a calm, steady life. On May 2, 2001, when Leslie was 48, she was supposed to be at work by 10 a.m. But she never showed up. About half an hour later, her boss started to worry. Leslie had never missed work without calling in. He pulled her daughter's number from the emergency contacts and gave her a call. But at the time, she was at university and no longer living at home, so she had no idea where her mom could be. Next, her boss got in touch with Leslie's husband, but he didn't know anything either. He said he had left the house around 7:30 that morning, and at the time, Leslie was still getting ready for work. Usually, she left shortly after him, walked to the bus stop, and took the bus into Washington. The commute took about an hour, so by then, she should have been at the office. Her husband tried calling their home phone, but no one picked up. He started to seriously worry something might have happened to her, so he decided to head back to the house. Leslie's boss did the same, afraid she might be in danger. They both arrived around 11:30 and went inside. Right away, they noticed the front door was unlocked, but the house was quiet. Then, they saw red stains along the hallway walls that looked like blood, with several bloody footprints on the floor. Leslie's boss immediately called the police while her husband searched through the house. He found their dog shut inside the basement, but Leslie herself was nowhere to be seen. The 911 operator told them to step outside and wait for officers so they wouldn't disturb any potential evidence, and the men left the house together with the dog. Police arrived within minutes and began searching the house. When they went upstairs, they found Leslie's body in the bathroom, lying face down inside the shower stall. From the way she was positioned, detectives believed she had been killed elsewhere in the house, and the killer had dragged her into the shower afterward. It looked like he may have planned to rinse her off and wash away any traces of DNA. Crime scene techs also found evidence that the killer had tried to clean up blood from the floor and hallway door. More blood was discovered in the kitchen sink, the downstairs bathroom, and even on the trash can. All of this showed that the killer had stayed inside the house for some time after the murder, making an effort to cover his tracks. But with so much blood everywhere, it was a hopeless task. One detail stood out in particular. The killer had used cleaning products, but none of those chemicals were found in the house. That suggested he had brought them with him, planning the cleanup in advance. But even with all that evidence, the local police department decided they didn't have enough to officially classify the case as a homicide. Instead, they chose to wait for the coroner's report, leaving open the possibility that Leslie's death might have been some kind of accident. One theory was that she could have slipped while cleaning the bathroom, though that explanation didn't really line up with the facts. Because of this, the house wasn't processed the way a murder scene should have been. For example, investigators never swabbed the blood on the doorframe. They just left it there. Meanwhile, the word of Leslie's death spread quickly through the community, and people were stunned. This was a town known for having one of the lowest crime rates in the entire country, where murders almost never happened. What made things even worse was the silence from the police. Nobody understood what had really happened inside that house, and the uncertainty fueled even more fear. 2 days later, the medical examiner finished the autopsy, and the results left no doubt. This was a murder. Leslie had 7 wounds on her head, caused by being slammed against a sharp, solid surface. Later, investigators determined that those injuries matched the sharp corners of the baseboard in the hallway. It looked like the attacker had knocked her down and repeatedly bashed her head against the floor. On top of that, her body showed multiple abrasions consistent with a violent struggle, and there were also clear signs of strangulation. This confirmed the detectives' original theory. Leslie had been attacked and killed in the hallway, and afterward, the killer dragged her body upstairs to the bathroom, hoping to wash away the evidence. Forensics collected every possible blood sample from the house and sent them off to the lab. Meanwhile, now that detectives finally had proof they were dealing with a homicide, the real investigation began. While they waited on the DNA results, detectives started talking to Leslie's family and friends. Nobody could think of a single person who would want to hurt her. She didn't have enemies, and she never got into conflicts. Naturally, investigators first looked at Leslie's husband, Carl. He told them he'd left for work around 7:30 that morning, and a neighbor backed him up, saying they saw him leaving the house and even waving to someone at the window. His coworkers also confirmed that he showed up on time and stayed there until he got the call from Leslie's boss. That made it unlikely he could have committed the murder, unless he had somehow done it before heading to work. But there were no scratches or bruises on him, something almost impossible to avoid, given the defensive injuries Leslie had. On top of that, everyone who knew the couple swore their marriage was solid and happy. A short time later, the lab results came back. Forensics had identified foreign DNA mixed with Leslie's blood in 3 different spots throughout the house. They also found bits of skin under her fingernails, pointing to the same unknown individual. The problem was, the DNA didn't match anyone in the database. Testing against Carl's DNA also came back negative. Detectives went on to collect samples from several other men who knew Leslie, but none of those were a match either. There were no other solid leads at the crime scene, and detectives quickly hit a wall. They tried piecing together a timeline and realized the killer had just a little over 2 hours to break into the house, carry out the murder, attempt to clean up, and then get away. Since the blood hadn't been fully washed off, investigators even considered the possibility that the killer might still have been inside when Carl and Leslie's boss showed up. Maybe he spotted them through a window and slipped out the back door before they came in. With no real evidence or motive to go on, police started looking into whether Leslie's case could be tied to a string of burglaries in the area. But that theory went nowhere. A short time later, the county pulled together a special task force to review unsolved murders across nearby towns. There were 6 in total, and investigators thought they might be connected. In the end, though, that link was ruled out. For months after, the case went nowhere. Detectives kept running down different suspects, but every lead fizzled out. One of the biggest problems was motive. The killer hadn't stolen anything valuable from the house, and there was no sign of personal grudges. Leslie simply didn't have enemies. To detectives, it all looked like a completely random killing, a crime with no real sense behind it. From that point on, the case went cold for years, and detectives made no progress toward an arrest. Some people still believed the killer had to be Carl, that somehow he'd managed to outsmart investigators and walk away free. But Leslie's daughter never once believed her father was guilty. She stood by him through it all. That continued until 2017, when Carl passed away of natural causes. Later, his daughter said he died of a broken heart, never knowing who had taken his wife from him. In 2022, 21 years after Leslie's murder, the local police department put together a special cold case team. They reopened her case, but the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in the FBI's genetic database. So detectives went back over everything. They re-interviewed everyone connected to the investigation and once again reached out to the public, hoping that after all these years, someone might finally come forward with new information. But once again, nothing. That's when investigators decided to try a new approach. They sent the existing DNA samples to a company called Othram, which specialized in genetic genealogy. The way it works is, investigators take an unknown DNA sample and run it through public genealogy databases where people upload their own results. Almost every time, at least one relative pops up, even if it's a distant one. From there, experts build out family trees and trace them back to the most likely suspect, narrowing it down by things like age, location, and other details. The experts at Othram got to work, and before long, they managed to identify a relative of the killer, a man living in Romania. The connection turned out to be pretty distant, so it took another 2 years of digging through family trees before they finally got close to a real suspect. By 2024, they had zeroed in on a family that had been living in Leslie's town at the time of the murder. Their last name was Gliger, and the moment detectives heard it, they realized it wasn't unfamiliar. Looking back through the old case files, they found a tip that had come in nearly a year after the murder, pointing directly at a man named Eugene Gliger, a former neighbor. But that wasn't all. Detectives also discovered that Eugene had once dated the victim's daughter, Lauren. The two had been together for about 5 years. They first met in high school when they were both 15. Eugene lived just a 10-minute walk from Lauren's house, and he spent a lot of time there. Leslie thought he was a great guy, but Lauren's father never trusted him. He always said there was something off about Eugene, though he could never quite explain what it was. When they turned 20 and Lauren left for college, the relationship started to fizzle out, and eventually, they broke up. It was a clean break. Eugene didn't seem bitter or angry, and from that point on, Lauren barely stayed in touch with him. Over the years, though, Eugene racked up a string of arrests for illegal weapons possession, theft, and drunk driving. What made it strange was that he came from a well-off family and didn't need to steal cheap things from other people's homes. Still, none of those charges were serious enough to require him to submit a DNA sample, which explained why his profile was never in the FBI database. There was also another troubling incident that dated back to when Eugene and Lauren were 16. A woman had been attacked by a teenager, and she gave police a description that closely matched Eugene. He denied it, and none of his friends could imagine him doing something like that. In fact, Lauren and one of her friends even went down to the police station themselves to vouch for him, insisting he was completely harmless. At the time of Leslie's murder, Eugene was just 21. Detectives also uncovered another interesting detail. Only 2 months after the killing, he and his mother moved to Washington, D.C. From then on, he stayed off the radar, never getting into trouble again. What stood out was that even though a neighbor had tipped police off about him back in 2002, detectives never actually spoke to him about Leslie's case. But now, with his name flagged by the genealogical search, Eugene instantly became their prime suspect. By 2024, he was still living in D.C. and working for a company that sold surveillance equipment. Investigators started thinking about how to get a sample of his DNA, and that's when they learned he was due to return from Europe on June 9, 2024. They came up with a plan and reached out to airport staff for help. The plan was simple. A border officer pulled Eugene aside for what looked like a routine check. On the table nearby, they'd set out a few bottles of water, and Eugene casually grabbed one. A little later, he tossed the empty bottle into the trash, and detectives moved in right away. They collected it and sent it straight to the lab. Forensic experts swabbed the bottle for DNA and compared it to the genetic material found under Leslie's fingernails. It was a perfect match. That meant one thing. Leslie had scratched Eugene during the attack, leaving his DNA behind at the scene of her murder. With that undeniable evidence, detectives finally had their killer. A few days later, police approached Eugene outside his apartment and placed him under arrest. They brought Eugene in for questioning, and at first, the detectives kept things basic, asking when he'd last spoken to his ex-girlfriend or her mother, and whether he'd ever set foot in their house after the breakup. Eugene acted confused, like he didn't even know what they were talking about, and eventually he asked for a lawyer. That's when the detective laid it all out. Eugene's DNA had been found inside the victim's home. Eugene looked stunned. He stammered that he'd never given a DNA sample in his life. Then, his voice shaking, he claimed he couldn't remember anything at all and didn't know what to say. The detectives reminded him that if he wanted to continue with a lawyer, they'd have to wait. Eugene muttered that he didn't know what to do and asked if he could call his girlfriend for help. He was clearly rattled. His hands were trembling, his voice breaking, and then, he started to cry. "So you're saying I'm guilty before I've even been put into a court of law?" But the detective noticed something odd. Not a single tear actually rolled down his face. "There's no tears coming out of your face." She called Eugene out on it right there. Eugene quickly fired back that he was just dehydrated and his eyes were too dry for tears. Moments later, Eugene spiraled into a full-blown meltdown. My eyes are bloodshot red because I'm just tired and drained. I don't know what's going on. Accusing the detectives of trying to frame him and insisting yet again that he couldn't remember a thing. After the interrogation, detectives felt even more certain Eugene was guilty. His fake crying and scattered excuses only made things worse. And, with so much of his DNA found at the crime scene, they didn't need a confession. So, he was officially charged with first-degree murder. News of his arrest shocked many of his friends and relatives. To them, Eugene had always seemed harmless, upbeat, even generous. A guy who donated to charity and was deeply involved in his community. But not everyone was surprised. One of his ex-girlfriends shared that Eugene would often fly into rages during arguments, hurl objects at her, and punch holes in the walls. His own brother admitted he was genuinely afraid of him, believing Eugene was capable of turning violent. As for Lauren, she was in complete shock. The idea that her ex-boyfriend had murdered her mother was almost impossible to process. She recalled that shortly after the killing, she ran into Eugene and told him what had happened. He hugged her and quietly said, "I'm so sorry." The trial preparation dragged on for almost a year, and by May 2025, prosecutors decided to offer Eugene a deal. Under the terms, he would plead guilty and, in exchange, face second-degree murder instead of first-degree. That charge implied the killing wasn't premeditated and the maximum sentence was 30 years in prison. Eugene agreed to the deal and admitted guilt. But here's the catch. The plea didn't require him to explain the details of what happened, including his motive. To this day, no one knows why he killed Leslie. Detectives spent countless hours pressing him for answers, but he still refused to talk. Investigators have their theories. The leading one is that it started as a burglary gone wrong. Eugene had been linked to several thefts in the past, so detectives believed that this might have been his original plan. He knew the Jennings home inside and out, making it an easy target. Maybe he assumed no one would be home, but instead, came face to face with Leslie. She knew him well, so there was no way he could just walk away unrecognized, and panic could have pushed him to kill her. Still, the theory has holes. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, which raises the question of how Eugene even got inside. One possibility is that he simply knocked, and since Leslie had known him for years, she opened the door without hesitation. From there, he could have attacked her in the hallway. But if robbery wasn't the motive, then why did he do it? And if murder was the plan all along, why didn't he bring a weapon with him? In the end, Eugene's real motive may stay a mystery forever, unless one day he finally decides to tell the whole truth. In late August 2025, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison, but he still never explained why he had killed her. It's also worth noting that once Eugene was caught, the police department came under heavy criticism. The original team of investigators had a tip with his name just a year after the murder. Yet, for reasons no one can explain, they never even spoke to him. If they had taken his DNA sample back in 2002, this case might have been solved decades earlier. But of course, the past can't be undone. It's also worth noting that this case went down in history as the very first in Maryland to be solved through genetic genealogy, a method that has since helped crack hundreds of cases all across the country.